Good morning and thank you for joining me. My name is Greg Stafford and I host these day text videos every weekday at 5 a.m. Pacific Standard Time for those who wish to consider a portion of the biblical record or other related history at the start of our day. Sometimes people around the earth are actually ending their day just as we're starting ours here on the west coast of the United States. But either way, these day texts are intended to give us something to think about, whether we're just starting or just ending our day. So I call them day texts because they're applicable at any time of the day or evening, and you can even carry them through to the next morning, of course. And I post them along with the video so that people can talk about them or refer to them in addition to our live discussion. Today I'm going to be starting the biblical book of 1 Timothy. It's one of the letters written by the Apostle Paul, a Jew who converted to Christianity in the first century. And he wrote to a young man named Timothy, whom according to the book of Acts chapter 16 was actually the son of a Greek father, but who had a unique disposition that Paul was able to use to further the great message in a number of congregations and to encourage others as he traveled about and proclaimed the teachings of the Bible. So 1 Timothy, we have representation in terms of early transmission of texts in codexes like the Alexandrian Codex, Sinaiticus Codex, the Vaticanus Codex. We have people like Irenaeus, the middle of the second century, writing and quoting the letter of 1 Timothy. So like with all the other biblical books, we have credible textual history, and we have manuscripts of these letters, or of this particular letter, 1 Timothy, that give us assurance that it has been faithfully transmitted and that it represents essentially what the Apostle Paul wrote back in the first century. So it helps us to understand some of the teachings and the things that were happening to these early Christians. Now, I'm reading from the text that I have translated to this point in the Great Message translation. And so I have not translated every text in 1 Timothy. And I'm going to start with chapter 1, and I'm going to read just verses 3 and 4, because I think you'll see that it has enough information in just these two texts for us to consider and to benefit from. I try not to include too many verses unless they all relate to a particular account that you sort of need all of the text to understand properly. Otherwise, I try to group as few verses together as possible, but which contain enough for us to benefit from, so that it's worth our time and while. Verses just reviewing things that we already know, like expressions of thanks and praise to God. While those are important, those aren't the kind of things that we forget so often that we need to review them together every morning. All right, so 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. And there it reads, "Just as I urged you to remain in Ephesus while I traveled into Macedonia, in order that you might order certain ones not to teach other beliefs, nor to follow myths, nor endless genealogies, which offer unnecessarily difficult questionings, rather than an outworking of God according to a belief based on the best available reasons." So you notice here he talks a little bit about how he urged Timothy to stay in Ephesus while he went on and traveled, because he wanted people there in Ephesus not to be teaching a bunch of different beliefs and doctrines which were either not true or conflicting with the great message. And he goes on to talk about some of the related issues like following myths, genealogies, unnecessarily difficult questions. I mean, these are some of the things that people do today who claim to believe in Jesus and want to promote God, but they spend their whole life, their entire Christian ministry, as far as I can tell, with these unnecessarily difficult questionings, or looking at things like chronology and prophecy that are not the kind of teachings that bring us the certainty of understanding that we need in order to survive on a day-to-day basis. They may be related to our hope and the things that we ultimately believe. But again, what are we going to spend our time with? Now, are we going to spend our time with all these different teachings and beliefs? Or are we going to focus on the primary ones that are going to help the most people, fulfill our obligation to God, and allow us to assist people who may not know some of the things that we have learned, instead of presenting to them these difficult questions or genealogies and myths, things that aren't going to bring them closer to the truth. See, we don't spend our times with myths. Things like the flood is not a myth. The Garden of Eden is not a myth. Sodom and Gomorrah is not a myth. These are places and locations that are described, that you can show physically exist or existed. We don't spend our time with myths or genealogies. We have the genealogies we need. We have 2 complete genealogies of Jesus and his descendant from God, Adam, David, and Mary. So that's the one we need to know most about, because he was promised and foretold to come in the line of David long before he was even born. So outside of that, and we don't even have the genealogical records that the Jews kept before the temple was destroyed in 70 AD anymore to be able to review. But back then they did. This was before the destruction of the temple, and so a lot of these things were still an issue for many people. But notice what Paul says we should do instead. We should focus on an outworking of God according to unnecessarily difficult questions? No. According to a belief based on the best available reasons, or faith. That's what faith is. Faith is belief. You believe something, you have the reasons, and you promote the belief. You don't promote all these questions and difficult ideas. That's not promoting belief. That's promoting the opposite of belief. Questions. There are people that just run around all day like chickens with their heads cut off. Although they wouldn't be able to talk at that point. But my point is, not to use a crude metaphor, but the idea behind that reference is that some people just act crazy, and they act like they don't even have their heads screwed on tightly, and they are non-stop questioning. They just want to question and question and question, and you could answer the question and they'll still ask the question. As I said before, there are some people you could go to 10 years from now. They will still be asking the question. It's like, who's the firstborn? What's God's name? They still haven't answered the question, and they're so obvious. The answers are right there all over the place. But they don't want to believe. And asking these questions over and over again prove they don't want to believe. They want to ask the question. They want to destabilize belief or make themselves feel better because they don't believe by questioning the beliefs of others. See, they're too lazy or too ignorant to spend the time and find out the answers to their own questions. So instead they run around, again, like a chicken with its head cut off, and they burden everybody they can find with their questions. I mean, it's one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen an adult person do. And I saw these people doing it 10 years ago. And I've seen some of them recently doing the exact same things. So that's how I know that in 10 years, if you go to these same people who keep arguing over these things, the Trinity and the firstborn and God's name, they're still going to be asking the question. They haven't figured it out in 10 years or the 10 years before that. Why would another 10 years help them figure out the answer to the question? It won't, because they don't want the answer. They want the question. And that's why Paul warns you about that right here. If you find people and they've spent, a year, even less, but let's say at least a year studying the Bible, and they don't know definitively who the firstborn of God is, they don't know how to properly pronounce the least disputable form of God's name, They're not interested in finding out. They're not going to find out because the answers are not going to change. They're right there, just as they've been there 10 years ago and 10 years before that, and they'll be here 10 years from now. They'll still keep asking the question. So I encourage you to stay away from people who all they want to do is ask you the exact same question they were asking you 10 years ago, versus promoting an outworking of belief and something that we can actually use, like showing love to each other, teaching the truth about Jah, or promoting the fulfillment of pre-Christian texts that talk about Jesus and his coming and the things that he would do. Those are the kinds of things we should promote if we really believe them to be true. So I thank you all for joining me this morning. I'll go ahead and post the day text with the video and then upload it. Have a wonderful Christmas day. Enjoy your week. I will be back tomorrow, the 26th at 5 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, as we work our way through the first letter to Timothy. Thank you all for joining me. Have a wonderful day, and may God bless you. Thank you.